All right. Yeah. So today, let's talk about blend modes. So blend modes, I'm going to be illustrating to you in edit mode. And I'm going to be doing that because it is a layered function, and I can actually directly show you what's applying. But so I'm going to bring this image right here, this picture of Lisbon, which I was personally in a couple last year, which was really nice. And then what I've done to sort of make this an easier to understand process is I've gone ahead and I've essentially made this luminance image here and a color image that displays all the different varieties of colors and spectrums of saturation and that sort of thing. So I'm going to pull these images onto my layer panel and I'm going to place them above my layer one. And then we'll show you how blending works and in regards to those separate images. But yeah, if you want to work with multiple layers in your layer panel, which is just located on the right in edit mode here, you can, like I said, use your film strip, which is down at the bottom, to drag and drop a file, which will add it to the layer panel. I'm just going to commit that layer here. Or alternatively, you can just use this button in the adjustment layers panel just below the layer panel to add a file as a layer, which we can then navigate to that same file if we wanted to. I'll find my pictures folder, go to that folder, which is August 25th, workshop, August 25th. And I'll grab this color file, and that will, just like drawing it with the film strip, it'll pull it and put it onto our layer panel. We'll just hide these for now. So blending in edit mode is, or actually blending in AC/DC is when you take pixels from one layer and you blend them with another layer. And so in this video, we're going to be using a base layer, which is this image of Lisbon here, which I'm going to right click and I'm just going to rename this layer to make it simple. I'll just call this my base. And then we have a layer that's above it, this black and white image here that displays the different tones. I'm going to right click and rename this layer and call it luminance. Stephen, when you add a file, when you drag and drop a file, for example, into your layer panel, it's going to ask you to commit the layer in essence, because when you drop it in, you have the ability to move the layer and resize it, that sort of thing. So committing a layer is like finalizing its location. That's all it is. So I have this secondary luminance layer that I renamed. And then I'm just going to click on this color layer here, and I'll just rename this, and I'll call this, actually let's call this hue. There we go. So when we're going through, we're going to go through the process of blending these hue and luminance layers with the base layer that exists beneath it. And normally I would storm right through, but because there's a lot of new users, I'm just going to quickly take a moment to explain layer order. So this layer panel is how we basically make composition images. When you place a layer above another one on the layer panel, so our base layer is our bottom layer here and our luminance exists above it. If we unhide this layer, we're seeing luminance that exists over top of our base layer. And both of these layers have a blend mode that is set to something called normal, which all that means in this case is that we're seeing those pixels in full values. There's no opacity or transparency applied. And the layer that exists above the base layer in this case is always going to take visual precedence over that layer. And what I mean by that is we're always going to see that layer over top of it unless there's, like I said, transparency, some degree of blending, or there's a mask involved. This workshop will not be covering masks. So if you want to learn more about that, that's in a separate workshop, which we can link you to later. But all you need to know is that the layers, in this case, layer order matters. The layer at the top will always be seen in preference to the layer beneath it, with the exception of when we go to apply opacity or blending, which is what we're talking about today. So There are 25 blend modes, and they're located right here. So if I click on my base layer, for example, and I go over to this layer order, or just underneath or just above rather, the layer order, there's 25 blend modes that exist in this little drop-down bar. And we're going to be talking about the ones that I use a lot, and ones that I think are more important to learn about there's a lot of information here. But the ones that we're going to be talking about today are the normal blend mode, dissolve. We're going to be talking about screen, multiply, dodge, burn, overlay, hard light, and soft light. In addition to, I think we'll also talk about color and luminosity if we have time. But these blend modes are like really commonly used, and they have like really interesting effects in how they're going to change this image. So blend modes are a really useful way to create non-destructive effects in images. Non-destructive in this case, because we can go in at any point and alter these values as they exist in our layer order. We can also go ahead and save this file as an ACDC file, which means that we can then change these values at any point. Months down the line, we could reopen this file and change these values. So they're available for any layer, and there's a variety of different ways to apply these effects. Like I said, there are blend modes in develop mode. There's blend modes in a variety of these filters when we go to apply them. But today we're going to be looking at them within the layer order because it's the easiest way to understand them at the very beginning. So when we apply a blend mode, basically what's happening is ACDC is going to blend the pixels of the selected layer against the pixels in the base layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to make a duplicate of this base before we start interacting with these other two files here. To make a duplicate, I'm just going to right click and duplicate my layer, and I'll copy it, calling it base copy one. If I just do a blend very simple, we'll just start with multiply, and we'll be explaining this in a moment, but just to illustrate an effect, we're applying a blend mode. So when we apply this, ACDC is going to blend the pixels of the selected layer, which in this case is the base layer, the copy, against the layers that are in in this case, the true base layer, which is the layer at the bottom. Okay. These applications vary depending upon the operation of the individual blend mode. In this case, this individual blend mode that we're looking at is multiply. So in this conversation, we're going to be talking about three important things. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this. I don't need it anymore. We're going to be talking about the base, this file right here, which is our original photo file, let's say. This is the original pixels, the layer found beneath the blended layer. The blended layer in this case is the pixels that are being blended to the base layer. And the two that we're going to be focusing on today are hue and luminance. We'll just illustrate. So we'll make a blend and then we'll apply it to luminance. We'll make a blend, we'll apply it to hue and see how it changes our image. And then the result is what occurs after basically that operation is complete. And then we'll see how that impacts our file. So the three things I want us to think about while we're watching this workshop is the base, the blend, and then the result, the final result of the actual blended layer. So each blend in this case is going to sort of work within the operation of luminance, brightness, and darkness. So we're going to be playing around with each of these 25 blend modes. They're going to be working with in different values and in different operations, those things. So let's first I guess to apply a blend mode, the first two that we're going to be talking about are normal and dissolve. So normal and dissolve are blend modes that don't, in this case, they don't actually, they're sort of like static. They don't actually blend with the layer that exists beneath it. The only way that we can interact with them is by lowering the opacity. So if we have, for example, turned on this luminance layer, okay, so I have turned it on by displaying it with the eye icon that exists next to it. As normal, it's just set at full opacity. We see this image. So what are we looking at? So in our image, we have a spectrum of blacks, basically, luminance going from 100% black to 100% white. So in this case, this brightness is set to 0, and then we have an increment of 10, and then an increment of 20, and then 30, and 40, and 50, and 60, and 70, 80, 90, and then 100 of brightness. And we can verify this by using the color picker. So I'll just color pick black here, for example, and then go into the information about the color. And it looks like our black is set to 0 in this area. If we use the color picker again, it's in this case set to 26. Going up to the very top is set to 255, meaning it's fully white in this case. So we can see that there's essentially a graduation from 0 to 255 up at the very top. Then we just have a flat white sample, a flat black sample, and then we have, in this case, 50% gray, which is a midtone, black, white, and then a very, very gradual individual 1% increase as we go through. So from 0 to 255% brightness. So normal, this blend mode just displays at full opacity, no transparency whatsoever. The only way to interact with the normal blend mode is by reducing the opacity. And as we reduce the opacity, we start to see the base layer come through. So if we place this opacity at 50, we're now seeing 50% of this image that's being displayed over 100% of the image that exists underneath of it. So this is not a blend mode, we're just interacting with opacity in this case. Dissolve, this guy right here, as you may notice, also appears to be fully opacity when we apply it. So dissolve is kind of different from the other blend modes. It produces a speckling pattern when it's applied, and then when the opacity is reduced. As it's reduced, we'll start to see it reveal individual pixels of the base layer that exists behind it. So this is a different form. In this case, we're sort of interacting with opacity and dissolve as a blend mode. So the two, like in this case, normal blend modes that only exist or only work with opacity are dissolve and normal. Then when we start working with other ones like screen, multiply, overlay, hard light, soft light, that sort of thing, they operate on their own without need to utilize something like opacity. So let's have a look at screen, which is the third or the second actual blend mode that exists within our blend pattern here, or our listing here. So I'm going to take luminance, and then I'm going to apply screen to the luminance field here. And we're going to see a very different interaction or result in this case with luminance being our blended layer interacting with our base layer. So what screen does, screen multiplies the inverse of the blend and the base pixels. And ultimately what that means to you is that it's going to result in a brighter image. But if we look at that gradient that existed in the center of our image, that gradient indicates that blacks and darker colors are being essentially increasingly ignored as it goes to the left here. While our image is brightened, in this case, it becomes brighter, closer to white as we approach those whites. So this is really cool because in this case where we have this black layer, these two black layers, we're not seeing any interaction with that at all. So I'm going to just go back to normal, for example, and we'll have another look at what we're seeing. So this black is not being applied to the base layer. It's just the whites. So if you want to impact an image that is underexposed, this could be a method that you use to get that effect. Let's have a look at screen, and we apply it with the hue section here and see how this impacts our image when we apply screen blending. So if we do that, you can see that all of our image is getting impacted by this, but the section that was darker, again, I'll just set it back to a normal blend. This was much, much, much darker than our straight hue that exists right here, or our lighter variation right here. And so we know, based on our experience with the luminance model, this model, is that it's gonna be closer to the true base layer than it will be the other two sliders here. So if we apply that, it does appear in this case that this one, the darker color sphere, color wheel rather, is closest to our true image. And you can see that like our gray that we're using, that 50% gray that exists elsewhere, is also pretty close to our original image. It's just when we start seeing colors that have a very high brightness, like this section right here, where we start to see something that in essence looks like it's washed out, or it looks like it has it's overly exposed. And then as you notice, there's a variety of other colors that exist at the base of our image here. So we have a spectrum of from like red to purple, and colors that have a higher brightness, for example, yellow with a brightness of 250, or rather yellow that has a red of 255 and green of 227, is going to appear more washed out than something like this blue that has red values of 6 and blue values of 144. So we'll look at that again. And there's far more contrast that we can see here in this part of our image than we can actually see here. It's much more washed out in this section. So again, yellow, because there's more, yellow because it's an inherently brighter spectrum than something like our purples and blues here, is more washed out. So this is sort of an interesting way that we can replicate that experience of this luminance screen change utilizing those colors. So screen and multiply are really, really, really common blend modes. Screen and multiply I use constantly, and I've used them for many, many, many years. Interacting, in this case, you can multiply one of your other base layers against another base layers, and using some of the, or rather blending the blended layer above it over another one to get like a much darker appearance. So let's have a look at multiply in this case. So multiply is going to do kind of the exact opposite. Multiply looks like it's ignoring the whites in this case, or things that are closest to the whites, and applying the things that are further down the black spectrum. So multiply is the opposite of screen as a blend mode. It multiplies the luminosity of the base pixels and then by the blended pixels. So white in this case produces no change, while the blacks increasingly darken our base image, as exemplified by this slow gradient from black to white at the end, the bottom of our image. So black, true black, being 000, is displayed as fully black in our image. Our midtones that are essentially gray, with our gray sitting about 50% here, significantly darken our image, as you can see by the box where that gray exists. And then the white has made zero application to this part of our image, as it's also seen here, here, and here. Let's have a look at multiply being utilized with hues instead of the luminance here. So I'll just go to our hue image, and again, I'll just multiply. I'll click the multiplication area instead of screen as we had it set to previously. And again, we can see parts, which is really interesting, parts that were washed out in the previous example, like the yellow area, now have much higher contrast than that of the blues, this area right here, which seemingly has a little bit less contrast, because the application of blue, which is a darker color than that of yellow, which is a lighter color, is quite different. And then again, our darker color spectrum applies a much darker effect to this section of the image, and our lighter, it looks like it's almost not impacting this image at all. It's very close to the true values of the image. And in fact, we can actually check that by unclicking that and sort of verifying that, especially in and around the blue here, there's very little change to that color. In fact, we can actually check this. Let's see how much it changes. In this area specifically, we have a red of 123 values. I'm just going to write these down, 188 and 218. And then if we unclick that in that same area, it's the difference is about 20 to 30 changes in this case in hue in those areas. So that's really close. So that effect in this case is dramatically darkening this image, especially in the areas in this case that are inherently with the colors that are inherently darker than the yellows and the light greens, cyans, that sort of thing. So let's talk about dodge now. Actually, let's have a look and see if there's any questions just before. Looks like everyone's good so far. But if I have any questions as we come up, if they pertain to what I'm talking about, I'll answer them. The next one in our layer panel here, our blend panel that we're going to talk about is dodge. So I'm just going to hide the hue layer, and we'll have another look at luminance, and we'll bring up the dodge section here. So dodge is is going to pretty dramatically change our image. And once again, let's just have another look at this base luminance layer. So again, we're working from black to white. And as we apply this, we're starting to see a significant washout, especially the area where it comes closer to white. So what dodge is doing is it gives a brighter result than that of screen by decreasing the contrast between base pixels and then the blended pixels. And what it does is it results in a significantly saturated image, where the midtones, in this case, are overexposed, or sorry, the midtones are oversaturated and the highlights in this case are overexposed. So in our area right here where our spectrum is sort of on the lighter end of the spectrum all the way to whites, we've completely lost all of we're massively overexposing these highlights. And in areas like our midtones here, we are seeing a lot of saturation in these midtones. Terry said, how do you create the HUE layer you're using? Oh, are you looking at this guy? So the hue layer using, oh, how did I create this layer itself? Oh, I created it, it actually took a while, but I created it using AC/DC. You can create like a spectrum here. I'll cover that in a tutorial. That would be better for something like that than for the workshop, because it would take too long to do. But it is possible. But these, you can also find these color sort of spectrum images online. They're very easy to get. I just wanted to quickly make one instead of, downloading something off the internet. And actually, you know what? I might actually make them available for people because they're kind of useful. So I'll create a link, and then when I go to upload this workshop video, they'll be in the description of that, because it makes more sense for people to just quickly download those than. But anyway, yes, I'll make those available. So as we were talking about, we're talking about dodging using the dodge blend mode in regards to luminance. Let's have a look at how it impacts hue in this case. So I'm going to go to the hue layer, and I'm going to change it from multiplication to dodge. And once again, we're going to see a very similar effect. And it's really, we're starting to see intense saturation in areas in the center here, which represent areas that look like our midtones on our base layer. But this whole wheel we can no longer see because it represents something that's closer to a whites in our spectrum, and then therefore is oversaturated in our image. So as you may guess, the next one we're going to talk about is burn, and burn is going to do pretty much the exact opposite effect to this. It's going to be doing in this case, burn is going to darken parts of our image significantly by increasing the contrast between the base and then the blended layers. But yeah, so this is the effect that you can get by applying dodge. There's really interesting aspects of this, because where the contrast between the houses here, where we've applied this yellow hue change, you can immediately see it goes from essentially 255, very close to true white, to the change in the yellow here. And just to describe what that looks like here, is it's very close to white here, and then a completely different spectrum that's being hypersaturated with that yellow. So I find this area quite interesting to look at in terms of the variation between those hues. Okay, so let's talk about burn. So I'm going to go one more down. So we've talked about normal, dissolve, screen, multiply, dodge, and let's have a look at burn. So burn is just it's essentially a much more dramatic version of multiply, just as dodge in this case is a much more dramatic version of screen. So the image is way, 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 way more saturated in midtones. Or rather, the result is more saturated in midtones and is slightly more overexposed in areas where, underexposed rather, in areas with the highlights. So some of these highlights have been then underexposed, and our midtones have become far more saturated in color. They're just also darker in color. And again, we can look at our white. Our application of white here is non-existent in the center of our image. So a burn in this case is not going to impact those white values, and it's going to have a very light adjustment in areas where our colors in this case are quite a bit, our tones in this case are quite a bit brighter, versus tones where they're quite a bit darker. So you can think of screen and multiply as very gradual, and you can think of burn and dodge as much more dramatic and really adjusting further the contrast that you see in your image. Let's have a look at the burn with the this guy right here. Yeah, so in essence, true, where the areas of our image that are darker here with these blues that are being applied, these purples that are being applied, we're getting colors that are in essence black, very close to black. Parts of our image here that are black. We're losing a lot of contrast in the sky. We're losing a lot of contrast in the buildings, roofs, that sort of thing. Areas where the colors are once again brighter in general, like our yellows and our cyans and that sort of thing, the contrast is not as impacted by that change. And once again, let's just swap it. Let's go over to dodge and then see the effect of that again. So we're losing all of those highlights. We're losing all of those whites. They're just getting completely washed out. And then the same is occurring in this case for the blacks. And again, you're thinking, Adam, like, well, I mean, how do I utilize these in a more practical sense? And keep in mind that because these layers, have a blend mode applied to them, this is non-destructive. We can apply any other blend mode to this layer. We can apply something like a mask to a layer and mask out portions of our image where we don't want to see that application apply. So there's lots of different ways to interact with parts of our image and utilize their functions on parts of our image while limiting it. So in essence, this is very similar to for those of you that have used other sort of, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I'm gonna undo delete and just delete the mask here. In order to to make these changes, sometimes we'd be working with individual nibs and destructively adjusting our image by painting on these, like in other softwares there's like the dodge and burn. We can use the dodge and burn filter within the filter menu, but you can get the same application using our dodge and burn on our layers, right? Or adjustment layers, and then applying them selectively by brushing off the areas that we don't need. We'll talk about a little bit more about that at the end. Let's go on now and talk about overlay. So overlay, essentially the next three blend modes that we use are my favorite, and overlay is a really good example of a really smart and useful blend mode. So Franz has a question. You said the opacity slider doesn't work with most blend modes. I thought it did, as it is possible to apply these base layer before blending, which will give it the different result. No, you're totally correct. And what I meant, okay, I'll illustrate this again. So when a layer, what I was referring to is normal and dissolve. Normal and dissolve don't actually impact the image on their own. They only impact their image as you start to, here, let's dissolve this layer, as you reduce the opacity. What I want to separate though is the fact that these effects like multiply and burn and difference and all these hard light, which we'll talk about in a second, all of these have an application before adjusting the opacity. Okay, like so it's only normal and dissolve in this case within the blend modes that require you to adjust the opacity. The remainders already will have an inherent effect, and then you can further adjust the incrementalness of that change with something like the opacity bar. That's a great question. I'm sorry I wasn't clear on that. So let's talk about overlay. So yeah, you're welcome, friends. No, that was a really good question. So I'm going to go to this luminance layer and I'll apply overlay this time. So I'm going to go down to our bar here and then select overlay from the drop-down bar. So overlay is a mixture of multiply and screen blending. It's not as extreme as both of those in terms of the way that it applies its changes. But what it does do is it utilizes screen blending. Okay, so remember, screen blending was the one that that added more brightness to your image. Screen blending for pixels that are lighter than 50% and 50% gray in this case. And then what it will do is it will multiply pixels, so it'll make it darker for areas that are less than 50% gray. And what I mean by 50% gray is really important here. So here's something that's brighter. Okay, this area right here, which is our true white, is much brighter than 50% gray. And this black here is much darker than our 50% gray. And I think this should probably represent as close to 50% gray as we can get, but let's see. Yeah, so brightness is 128. That's pretty good because the total brightness is 255, which equals white, and 0, which equals black. So in the middle, which would be about 100, yes, in this case, we had 128. So this is as close to our 50% gray as we're going to get here. This also represented by that same color, that 50% gray, and somewhere in the middle here is our 50% gray. So what we're going to see when we apply opacity to this image, this opacity blending, is that these center parts of our image represented, or our blend mode here, are going to remain basically, they're going to look very unchanged. The base layer will have very little application of effect in those areas. It's only in the brighter areas and the darker areas where we're going to start to see an effect by the opacity blend mode. So let's have a look. Yeah, so this is quite close to our base image. And if we look at it here by just tapping this off, you'll see that it's so close, there's actually no change in the center here at all. It's only as we slide further towards whites and further towards blacks that we start to see an effect apply, and that can be seen in the sky here, in addition to this gradient that we have in the center. So when it's calculating the result of this effects, overlay uses the base layer, okay? So this layer, not the luminance layer that exists above it, not this layer, not the blended layer. So that's why when we calculate these things, it looks, we're still seeing fairly significant contrast in our whole image versus when we were using something like the dodge function or the burn function, where we're absolutely losing contrast in the areas of the high or in the darks, depending on which tool we're using. So in the center, we have that 50% gray, and we're maintaining a degree of contrast. We're still seeing that application all the way through the right and all the way through the left as well. So I think this is really cool because this overlay is one that I use very, very significantly, very often, because you can still maintain some degree of that contrast all throughout the image while still impacting and changing your image as you need. So in this case, where we have this black bar down at the bottom, we're seeing like a significant adjustment. It's made significantly, there's more contrast in this area, there's more darks in this area than in the area of the center, which is represented by the gray. Let's have a look at it in relation to hue. So I'm going to go over to overlay here on our hue layer, and this is going to be kind of different. This area with moderate saturation is pretty close to what we're what looks like our original image, and the reason why that is the case is because these colors are closer to like around 150, 160 brightness. And as you can see, as I scroll through and we're looking at the color picker, their relationship, or rather their values in terms of brightness, are closer to the sort of the middle range of our. And I'll bring up the this guy again to illustrate this. But if this brightness was 255, right, it would probably be somewhere closer to here. This area, this region right here, has a much higher brightness than an area like, say, here in our image, which has a much lower brightness. So when we apply overlay, the center portion of our image is going to get like a varying effect. And in this area where we're looking at low saturation, again, I'll just illustrate this. This is a much darker portion of our image. This is fully saturated portion of our image. And then we have our very bright section here, our bright color spectrum. So what I'm saying is the areas that have a closer to 50% saturation, or brightness rather, are going to appear a little bit more normal, a little bit more natural to that of our true image. But as we're looking at this, it's really just this gray in the background that we're seeing that represents the true colors. So the center section that is represented by the gray in the background is what the original image looked like. And then you start to see how the colors interact underneath. Again, overlay is a really useful tool. I use this one quite a bit. Soft light, which is the next one we'll talk about in luminance here. Soft light is like a much less egregious version of overlay. So we'll compare the two actually. I'll add another layer here, and I'll just set this one to color or overlay, and then we can compare them here. So this application right here of our first luminance layer is a soft light. So soft light is functionally, it's a more gradual version of overlay. So it applies the same over and under 50% gray, depending on the luminance values, but it doesn't have the same contrast loss as that of overlay in this case. Overlay has a slightly higher contrast loss than something like soft light. So here's our soft light layer. I'm just going to hide that, and we'll display our overlay layer. As you can see, there's still significant contrast in the whole image, but there's much more parts of our image where it's quite a bit more washed out than that of our soft light layer, which we can still see gets brighter as we apply that white, gets darker as we apply those true blacks, but is much more gradual. So this is a nice one to utilize if you want to get more depth and contrast out of your image, but still, in this case, depending on the spectrum, apply more blacks or more whites. It's just a very gradual addition. Let's have a look at hue in relation to soft light. So here's our hue layer. That's our overlay. Let's have a look at soft light. So this would be an interesting way, and I think when we were talking about colorizing our images in the workshop where we were working with a sepia tone image or black or white images, this was a useful way to add color in parts of our image that was very gradual. And if I'm remembering correctly, I believe we used multiply, color, soft light, and we may have used luminosity to get change those values in our image. So when we were dealing with monochromatic images, black and white images, sepia tone images, these functions, these ability to add soft light, or in this case, adding these hues, is really valuable. Again, this is fairly gradual. All of these colors are visible. The contrast is fairly significant, fairly visible in the whole image. Here's a comparison to that of overlay in the same thing. So you start to see areas of our image, especially in relation to the darker colors, get much darker. There's much more added contrast in those areas versus soft light, which is sort of like a much more universal application of those hues. Let's have a talk about color. So this would make more sense to talk about hue first. See why. So here we have the colors of our hue layer being applied to our base layer. So color preserves the luminosity of the base layer while applying the hue and the saturation of the blended layer. So when I apply color to this layer, this hue layer right here, it's saying to our image, display those colors in this blended layer, and then in our base layer, display all of the luminance, all of the sort of granular detail of this image. We've used also color significantly for colorizing our black and white images, especially in the previous workshop, because again, you can directly apply a color to whatever already pre-existing luminance there is in the base layer. Keep in mind that a lot of times when you're working with black and white or sepia tone images, there is no existing color. It's either very, very light tones of orange, or it truly is a black and white image with spectrums, grayscale in this case. So this would be a good way to apply over top of your image. You can go in and add colors depending on what you think would fit in that area. If I was to add color, this is interesting. I'm pretty sure if I was to apply color to this luminance layer, which there is no colors in it, it would just make the whole thing black and white. So, or in this case, grayscale, because there's nothing to perceive here. So those variations of black and white don't matter because it's just trying to pull the color and apply it to the layer that exists beneath it, which in this case ultimately results in a black and white image, a grayscale image. And then the final one that we're going to talk about before we can apply some of these is luminosity. So I'm going to take this luminance layer and apply a luminosity blend mode. What luminosity does is it preserves the hue and the saturation of the base layer, this guy right here. So it's preserving the hue and saturation of this layer while applying the luminosity of the blended layer. So really what we're getting out of this is there's a ton of contrast between that of these like rooftops in the sky, and we really start to see the gradual application of, in this case, when we lower the brightness of our images over top of this image. And so like where this comes into play, why this might be useful, is in relation to something like a blend mode. So if we were to add a, say we were to add a black and white adjustment layer, okay, so over our base layer here, I'm just going to add black and white. And black and white normally is going to completely, obviously, turn our image into a grayscale. But if we were to take this layer and apply a luminosity change to our layer, so it's now utilizing the saturation and the hue of the layer beneath it, right? And then this is the layer where the luminosity is going to impact the image beneath it. So if we were to adjust things like brightness, we can start to see our image change considerably. If we were to say, hey, I want to make our blues darker, for example, or our blues much brighter, we start to see that impact in our image. Maybe we want to make the whole image brighter, but we want to make these reds quite a bit darker so that the roofs appear to have more contrast than the rest of our image. And this is possible because luminosity is applying whatever the color and hue or saturation and hue of the layer beneath it, and we're just adjusting these individual fields here. So this would be how you'd get something like, you can utilize that function of luminosity with an adjustment layer. So like I said earlier at the beginning of this, there's so many different blend modes. Like there's a ton of these different blend modes. You'll have to play around with a lot of these to get an inherent feel, like a sort of like an understanding of what they do in relation to your images. You're going to want to play around with them to get a to have like a sense of what they do. But you can take a look at these, and in this workshop we can have a look at, in this case we talked about screen and multiply and dodge and burn and overlay and soft light, hard light, luminosity and color, which are by and large the most used blend modes. and you can apply those and start to see how they can impact an image mathematically in order to have a better understanding of which one you'd want to use in relation to your image to begin with. So I said at the very beginning that there's places in which these blend modes live, and I wanted to talk about them in relation to layers because it made the most sense. We could illustrate how those the changes of gray, what from black to white, the gray and luminance can impact our image, and in color in relation to this hue layer. But like I said a moment ago, these are also available within every adjustment layer. So every layer that can exist within the layer panel has these properties, has the ability to change these blend modes. So for example, if we were to take an image like this, and let's say we were to take our base layer, okay? And I'll just remove these for now so we can see everything as is. But if we were to say, okay, I want to make the blue in our sky, right? I want to really make that section of our image, I want to make it quite a bit darker, okay? So there'd be a couple steps involved here. So we could take our base image. We could go, let's say I want to make a color EQ change, okay, to our image. So I'll add a color EQ layer. And then I'm going to take those blues that exist within these two spectrum sliders here. And I want to maybe, let's go into brightness, and we'll pull those down. So we can pull those down in that section. And then say that we're happy with those in terms of the application of that. But maybe we wanted to darken it by using like a multiplication layer. So take this, and so now we're multiplying the color EQ change in relation to these darkened colors here. So if we were to just set all these values to their natural to zeros, we get this impact on our image, and then we can slowly sort of start to darken those colors even more by reducing these sliders. And this is just within the brightness function. There's a variety of different ways to utilize this in relation to filters. So if I was to open up this image in a filter, for example, which is going to be a destructive change versus a non-destructive change in our layer panel, what we'll do is we'll duplicate this image. So I'm just going to click the duplicate button that exists beneath the layer panel. And then I can go into something like, let's say, light EQ. And we can make a really egregious change to this. So let's go into like basic settings in light EQ. And we can really pull down the midtones. I'll turn off the exposure warning so that you can see that. So as I pull down those midtones, all the center portion of our image here, especially in relation to these trees here, they get quite a bit darker. But we can use our blend mode in addition to whatever we're working on these sides to sort of make incremental changes. So if I was to use soft light, right, and what I know about soft light is that it's a similar function overlay, but the difference is going to be that it's going to maintain the contrast much better than overlay, and then I could reduce those midtones within that spectrum, right? So I can utilize this to get more incrementality out of something like these sliders here. And actually, this is really interesting. I mean, I would probably bring down the highlights too in this image, but I'm getting a lot more hue and saturation out of these clouds now. I'm getting a lot more contrast out of the houses in this image. There's a bit of blown out whites in this section right here, but I could probably fix that using a different mode. And I can always show previous to see that the saturation is much more moderate in this than in our and then after using this light EQ change with our midtones and our soft light. If we were to change this to something like, I don't know, multiply maybe, we're going to see, again, it's going to be made much, much darker due to the fact that we've decreased our midtones significantly in this, but also due to the fact that the multiplication layer that's being applied takes all the elements that exist within the spectrum of grays and dark and blacks and shadows and that sort of thing, and then it makes those things have more contrast. It makes them darker. if we were to apply color, oof, color and midtones, that's wild. The saturation is unreal in the rooftops. It's like over the top, very, very high saturation in this area. And then all that is it's when you're taking your midtones here and you're making those midtones, which is largely occupied by these rooftops here and a couple of these buildings, and makes them way, 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 way more red. I'm going to take a second here to talk about, have a look at some of these questions here. Yeah, sound off if you have any questions in the comments here. I'll have a look here too. So there's also develop mode for these kind of changes as well. So again, I can take the things I've learned in relation to the layer panel and bring it into a completely different mode. So we've utilized these functions within edit mode. We've looked at, in this case, we've looked at normal and dissolve. We've looked at blends like multiply and screen and overlay and color dodge and color burn. And all of those blend modes exist within certain functions in develop mode as well. Pardon me. So if I was to bring this image into develop mode, and we were to look at something like, let's see here, I believe split tone has this functionality. Tone curves, let's see. Color EQ. Oh, I think I understand why. I was thinking about this in regards to its application, but all of these changes are made parametrically, so I don't believe that blend modes exist within the functions in develop mode. I'm just gonna make one more double check on here, but I'm glad I did this. Color LUTs, soft focus, effects. Yeah, no, it does exist within some functionalities. So something like the photo effects, for example. Let's turn off this change here so you can see. I'll just reset those values. But something like the photo effects within develop mode will also have the ability to blend things like this. So if you were to take this effect, Sophia, for example, if in develop mode, you can go in and then you can apply a variety of these same blend modes within that section and also reduce the opacity. This might be more useful when you're doing like color overlays or gradient map overlays. Gradient map overlays are a really good example of this too, because you can input various colors within the shadows, for example, in your image, and oranges within the highlights on your image, and then adjust that gradient on your image using something like, again, like soft light change or hard light change within your image. And so with the effects panel supports blend modes within develop mode. And I'll go back to edit mode here. Olami asked, I guess this topic is like a catch up for me. Please, when I can get the topic, seems right. Yeah. So we've done several you can go check out our YouTube page, and there's a like a complete beginner's guide to edit mode. There's also a section 2 which is devoted to layers specifically. So if these sections, if some of these sections in regards to layers are a bit fast for you or don't make sense, please go to our page on our YouTube, and there's tons of information on more beginners guides in relation to like something like the layer panel. So yeah, check that out. I will relink that once again. That kind of brings. There's been a low question sort of a workshop today, but that is bringing us up to an hour. If anyone has any questions in relation to like blending or anything that they'd like to see in the product as a suggestion, or anything that they're curious about that I didn't cover today, I know that there was a couple questions at the very top that that people I wasn't able to answer. well, I'd love for you to email me. If you have any questions that are sort of outside of the scope of what we talked today, normally these workshops go about an hour and 20 minutes. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything that's more unrelated to blending today. Steve asked, hi Adam, is it worth mentioning that for reference, the ACDC help text explains what all the blends do, not as clearly in some cases as you have? Yeah, so if you go to, I believe our help contents here gives you the ability to search. So if we were to go to say something like, actually, let's go, yeah, multiply, see if there's a listing for it. But most of these things, yeah, so if you go into blend modes here, there's a sort of brief description that applies to each of these blend modes, and gives you some more context on those. What I really wanted to do